Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Franklin, and I'm president of the Cancer Support Community. For more than 35 years, we at the Cancer Support Community have been a relentless ally for anyone impacted by cancer. We help individuals manage the realities of this disruptive disease and get back to their normal. Whether accessing our free services in person at one of our 175 locations across the country, online, or overall our toll-free helpline, which is open 7 days a week, you are getting a team of licensed professionals providing patient navigation, financial counseling, genetic counseling, pediatric support, and much more. So today's topic, there have been some really important and game-changing developments in cancer diagnosis and treatment over the last few years. That's why we've decided to host a two-part series, because this is pretty complex and incredibly interesting, where we explore the ways cancer care has evolved to more personalized medical care and why it's so important for you to be sure that your cancer is fully understood before you begin treatment. Today's conversation is focused on the importance of testing. So we're going to talk about receiving the appropriate biomarker testing, and you may hear us say genomic, but I'm sure Andrea will speak to the fact that we say biomarker testing and how to use the information you learn as you make treatment decisions, including decisions about participating in a clinical trial. So I'm thrilled to bring you today's conversation in partnership with our friends and our incredible experts from the LUNGevity Foundation and the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. So I will introduce them and then we will start the conversation. So Andrea Ferris is president and CEO of the LUNGevity Foundation. The LUNGevity Foundation is one of the preeminent lung cancer organizations focused on improving outcomes for people with lung cancer through research, education, policy initiatives, and support and engagement for patients, survivors, and caregivers. The LUNGevity Foundation seeks to make an immediate impact on quality of life and survivorship for everyone touched by the disease, while promoting health equity by addressing disparities throughout the care continuum. And our friend Lynn Matrisian is Chief Science Officer at the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. She brings extensive experience and passion for cancer research combined with business training to provide strategic direction for the scientific aspects of the initiatives and activities within the scientific and medical affairs team towards the goal of improving outcomes for those facing pancreatic cancer. She was the founding chair at the Department of Cancer Biology in the School of Medicine at Vanderbilt University, the president of the American Association for Cancer Research, and a special assistant to the director of the National Cancer Institute at the National Institutes of Health. So welcome to both of our friends and experts today. I'm really excited to have you join us. And I also want to extend our gratitude to LabCorp Oncology for bringing you this important Facebook Live. So let's get into it. And I want to start with the basics because, like I said, this can be a really complex topic, but one that is so critical for anyone diagnosed with cancer to really understand. So Andrea, I want to start with you. When you think about genomic testing, biomarker testing, precision medicine, what does that mean and why should patients be interested?
So we at LUNGevity define precision medicine as biomarker-driven care, and it's along the entire cancer continuum. It could be from before you're diagnosed for risk stratification for screening purposes. It could be once you are diagnosed for either a neoadjuvant, so before surgery, or adjuvant, so after surgery, to determine your therapeutics or your risk of recurrence. And then I think where most people hear about it right now is in the advanced stage setting to help determine treatment options, which is hugely important at diagnosis, but it's also really important at progression or at recurrence for precision medicine. So we view it as precision biomarker-driven care, which obviously is determined through comprehensive biomarker testing. And we don't refer to it as genomic testing internally. And I think because biomarker testing takes it up a level, because not everything now, at least in some diseases like lung cancer, it's not genomic, it's protein based. And so we need to be sure to be advocating for the right thing and to be using the right words when describing what this important testing is. And it really helps you make your best treatment decision with your healthcare team in order of what's right for you.
That's great, Andrea. Thank you. And I wanted to make sure that we hit on that biomarker piece, and I know Lynn did as well. So that was a really helpful explanation. So Lynn, can you help us understand the difference between genetic and genomic testing?
Yeah, sure. So let's, how about a little refresher course in biology? And we'll start with when we started as a human being, we had genes from our mother and genes from our father, and that's the unique, mix of genes that make us us. So that those genes, which are DNA, our DNA blueprint is in every cell of our body. So that's when you do genetic testing, that's what you're looking at, that DNA, and you can look in any cell of your body and know what is the constitution of those genes that is your basic DNA blueprint. Now, when cancer occurs, a cell goes rogue. So there are changes that occur in that cell, be it in the lung, be it in the pancreas, being it wherever that cancer arises. And that DNA can change. And you can get alterations in that DNA that are specific only to that cancer. They're not found in every cell of the body. So the real difference and what sometimes hard to keep straight is that when we're talking in this case about genetic testing, we're talking about the genes you were born with. When we're talking about genomic or biomarker testing, a lot of times we're specifically talking about what the makeup, the DNA makeup, or any of the changes that happen in the tumor cell itself. And that requires looking at a piece of the tumor in order to understand that. And as Andrea was saying, there's information in there that can help us know how to treat that tumor because we've learned something about its particular makeup.
Great, Lynn. Thank you. That's incredibly helpful because I think a lot of times the average person may confuse genetic testing, genomic testing, and then we throw in this idea of biomarker testing. What about the concept of profiling? Is that any different? Is that a word that people should know? What do you think about that? Lynn,
Yeah,
I'll go.
You want me to answer? Yeah.
Sorry,
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yep. So molecular profiling is a kind of a broad term that's used often, and it's usually used in the context of genomic testing, tumor testing itself. So a lot of times people will say, get your tumor molecularly profiled. And that means let's understand what are the molecules that are different in that tumor that could be driving the tumor. Because if we understand what's driving the tumor, what made that tumor cell different than the normal cell, then maybe we have drugs that can reverse that effect. And that's really what we're looking for.
Great. Thank you. That's super helpful. And when we talk about both genomic testing and genetic testing, and this is a question for either one of you, can you help sort of the patient who's going in understand what that testing process would be like?
Sure. I can't speak to the genetic testing because lung cancer right now doesn't have an inherited component, which is really where most of the genetic testing comes in. So it really is the comprehensive biomarker or the genomic testing that happens. And so for solid tumors, of which lung cancer is one of them, most of the time it requires a biopsy. So the extraction of a piece or the entire tumor, if it's early stage, that then can be sent off to a lab for analysis. In some circumstances, and if the tissue is not available, there are starting to be what people might know of as liquid biopsies or blood-based biopsies that can be performed as well. However, I think it's still sort of the gold standard to try to use the tissue-based diagnosis first. Lynn, I don't know if you can talk to the genetic part. We don't have that in lung cancer.
Yep, and we do in pancreatic cancer. So very much like lung cancer, we do the biomarker testing of the tumor itself, and we think that's very important. But there is also the new guidelines say that everyone with pancreatic cancer should have genetic testing. And the reason is because there are inherited genes that predispose to pancreatic cancer. And some of those genes predispose to other cancer types as well. The famous ones are the BRCA genes, which predispose to breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and it turns out pancreatic cancer. And so we now recommend that every person who's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer understands whether they have a genetic predisposition to that cancer. And that's important for two reasons. One, it's important for them. There are certain drugs that have been FDA approved for people who have some of these alterations in all their DNA, in their inherited DNA. And so it's important for treatment. But then it's also important to understand the risk of family members of that individual that has pancreatic cancer. So if the person would turn out to have one of these predisposition genes, then you would want to test their siblings, their children, other family members to see whether they would be at higher risk or not. And the difference is you're either at higher risk or you're at absolutely normal risk. So you really want to know what those genes are telling you.
And I'm so glad that we asked about, that we had both of you on today to talk about both lung cancer and pancreatic cancer, so you can see the difference and that patients can understand. It really depends on the type of cancer you have to whether you should get genetic testing, genomic testing, and what you should know going into those appointments. So I'm glad that we clarified that. Thank you very much. Speaking of clarifying, Andrea, I'm going to ask you to try and clarify things as we get even more complex. So looking at different types of biomarker testing, some may have heard terms like next generation sequencing or multi-gene panels or other things. What are the different tests and what determines which one that a specific patient might have and when?
So I can't really speak to what a specific patient might have and when in lung cancer. So people might also hear of single analyte tests, single gene tests, and so forth. So in our disease, that could be an ALK mutation, an EGFR mutation, a ROS1 mutation, and other things like that. And when we started to really learn about the disease, and it has been just an exponential pace with which this learning has happened. But when it first started down the precision medicine path, there really were only 1 or 2 or 3 driver mutations. So people could test for one at a time, right? And you would test for one, and if it wasn't that, you would test for the other. What started happening, though, is now there are at least 9 drugs available, FDA approved, that have distinct driver mutations. You can't take a very small piece of tissue and test it for 9 different things sequentially. So in lung cancer and in other diseases where we are going down a really deep precision medicine path and understanding the drivers, and it's a very heterogeneous disease as well, which is also the complexity of it, you need to do a multi-analyte test. So really test for multiple of these driver mutations or biomarkers or fusion at the same time. And that could be either on a multi-gene panel, a multi-analyte panel, all the way up to a full next-gen sequencing, which is really just a very complex and bigger panel for multiple genes. They test up to 500 different ones. What determines whether a patient gets next-gen sequencing or a 10-gene panel or 50-gene panel? That's really up to the ordering physician. It's up to their healthcare system. Sometimes it's the insurance and the payers, sadly to say, that drive that decision. But at a minimum, that what people need to know is that they should at a minimum be tested for whatever is in the NCCN guidelines, and hopefully more, because there are, again, in our disease, a lot of clinical trials that are available. And often those clinical trials are now first line. It's not a second or a third or a treatment of last resort. It's the first treatment a person can get. and it's often best care. But if you're not tested for that mutation or that biomarker, you don't know that you may be eligible for that clinical trial.
Thanks, Andrea. And just to clarify, so folks know, NCCN, National Comprehensive Cancer Network. So they develop the guidelines for cancer care. I encourage folks to go to their website. They also have patient-friendly guides, so you can learn more about what types of cancer treatments are available and best practice for your type of cancer.
Yes.
Lynn, would you add anything to the concept around next-gen sequencing or multi-gene panels?
Yeah, so we're a little bit different in pancreatic cancer than in lung cancer, in that the mutations that we're looking for are a little more rare. Usually some of them only occur in 1% or less of the individuals with pancreatic cancer. At the most, maybe it's 5%. I mean, so we're looking at very small subpopulations, but when you add them together, you come up to maybe as much as 20% of pancreatic cancer would benefit from precision medicine. So we tend to like those very large gene panels. We tend to like them because we get as much information as we can from that tumor. And it's not as easy for us to make a specific panel to look at very specific things in pancreatic cancer, because we're looking for a whole bunch of little different things. But it's and luckily there are lots of those that are now available, and we can get all that information with one test. It's really pretty amazing.
Yeah. And what about with time, as we have these multi-gene panels, these big panels, as science evolves and we learn more about cancer and personalized medicine, can that be helpful for patients who have taken one of those bigger panel tests?
So we're continually looking for new drugs to target those specific alterations. There's a world of both basic science and then pharmaceutical science that are designing drugs that will, in essence, turn off the activity of those genes that have gone rogue. And that are doing activities that they're not supposed to. And so as we continually put those drugs into our repertoire, the FDA has started to recognize tumor agnostic approvals for drugs. So it doesn't matter whether it came from the lung or the pancreas. If it has this specific mutation, that you can try this drug. And so that really opens up this opportunity to find drugs that might be effective for individuals if you do the test and if you look for those different alterations. So I do think that the number of people who will benefit from this will only grow and grow and grow as we have more drugs that are tested and then become approved, particularly in this tumor agnostic, or this kind of for all comers, as long as they have that mutation.
And when you say tumor agnostic, Lynn, you mean that one drug could actually work for different types of cancer?
That's right. That drug could, if there is an ALK mutation, as is sometimes found in lung cancer, if you happen to find a pancreatic cancer with an ALK mutation, you can use that drug. So it's it's independent of what organ, what tissue that tumor arose in.
So it's about the mutation and not the tumor, or as Andrea said earlier, there's tumor, solid tumors like lung cancer. There's also blood cancers, but it's more about the mutation and not the actual type of cancer.
That's right.
And just to be clear, Elizabeth, though, that's not for everything. There are only certain mutations for which, and certain drugs for which that is the case. And so I don't want people to think that it's for any mutation.
Yep, that's a great point. And the science is evolving. So we say that today, and there could be future discoveries that allow us to understand even more in the future. But I think it's a really good point, Andrea. And I want to come back to something you said, because I think it's really important for people to understand. You talked about the need for testing in the beginning when you're diagnosed with cancer, but also with progression. Can you talk about that a little bit more and tell us the difference between the two?
Sure. And Lynn, please pipe in with the scientific aspect of it. But it's hugely important at diagnosis because to understand what's driving your particular cancer, because as Lynn said, there are many treatments now that could help to reverse that or stop it. A lot of cancers are really smart and they figure out ways around it also. And so then you might be hearing some terms called resistance mutations or mechanisms of resistance, which are a new biomarker or an existing one that perhaps was not as pronounced when the first test was done, that arise as your body and the cancer in your body learns how to live with the drugs that are being used to suppress it. And they figure out ways of getting around it. So if your cancer progresses, it's really important, again, in some diseases, and talk to your healthcare provider, but to be tested again to understand what's driving that progression or what's driving that new cancer, if it's a new cancer that springs up in its place, so that then a more targeted drug could be given to you at that point in time. So in lung, we think it's hugely important at any time you're making a treatment decision or changing your treatments or making at that inflection point to either be tested again or to go back to your original test results to see if that has some other information in it for you.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Andrea. Lynn, would you add anything to that, or did Andrea get the science spot on, which I think she did?
Yep. Oh, yep. That's very good. That's really good job, Andrea.
Good. And I want to talk about that moment, especially at diagnosis. And we hear that sometimes testing can take a little bit of time, and that often coming from the cancer support community, that often increases distress in patients. If they're told, let's wait, we need to test your tumor, it's going to give us important information. But why is that so important to wait for the test?
So I can take it, but Lynn, go ahead.
Well, I think it's really important in lung cancer.
Yeah.
I think in pancreatic cancer, we have no molecularly defined first line therapies. So it's usually second or third line before you're really, I think that often that's what happens before you're really ready to know what drug to use based on the molecular profile. A potential difference is these genetic alterations that I was talking about, which are relevant in pancreatic cancer. If you already know that you have that genetic alteration, that may make a difference. But in general, the tumor alterations, the genomic alterations that we've been talking about, are usually used a little bit later on. So we want people to get tested early on so they have that in their back pocket in case they need it as they go through their journey, and if in case they need another treatment.
Did Elizabeth freeze?
I think we lost Elizabeth.
So while she did, then I'll go ahead and add some information with
Maybe
respect to lung. Sorry, Elizabeth?
Can you hear me?
Now we can, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
I was just going to add some information with respect to lung cancer. And so we actually refer to it as the testing to treatment gap, if you will, in terms of the lag. And for us, it's actually hugely important that if possible, and it's not always possible, sometimes if people have a very aggressive disease, they do need to be treated right away. But ordinarily that 2-week time frame it's hugely important to wait, recognizing that it is very stressful and anxiety-ridden time. But also the providers need to explain to patients and to people who are diagnosed why it's so important. And it's not just so that you can get your best treatment first and your best chance of treatment. There are some treatments that if you go on it and it's inappropriate for you, you might be prevented from going on one that, at a later point in time, that is better for you. A perfect example of this now, many doctors automatically defer to immunotherapy, which works for a lot of people, but not everybody. And if you have one of these driver mutations, oftentimes if you've been on immunotherapy, you can no longer take the drug because of the side effects and the interactions, and it could provide really, really bad adverse events for you. So the best drug for you, you have now cut off that ability to take because you didn't wait for your testing results. So for us, it's hugely important, albeit very stressful, and when possible, to wait for the test results before making that treatment decision, so you can have a fully informed conversation with your healthcare team.
Absolutely, Andrea. I appreciate that. And I think, sometimes cancer patients feel like they're bombarded with so much information that it's hard to be able to sort through it. But when it comes to this, it's incredibly important for them to have access to that information so that when they do go and have a conversation with their provider. So when you talk to the patients that you work with, Andrea, and you're saying, okay, you're about to go have a conversation with your physician, can we talk about what that conversation looks like? How should it flow? What kinds of questions should patients ask? And should clinical trials be a part of the questions that they ask their provider?
Absolutely. And I think clinical trials should always be a part of the conversation. And I think we just need to be somewhat careful. And Elizabeth, I'm sure you do the same thing, and Lynn the same, is how much is the responsibility of the patient versus how much is the responsibility of the healthcare system? As you said, when you're diagnosed with any one of these diseases, it's a highly stressful, anxiety-ridden time that you're already have all this terminology being thrown at you. You shouldn't have to advocate and request comprehensive biomarker testing. It's guideline, it's malpractice not to do it, right? That said, there are a lot of people who still do need to ask for it. So I think from a patient perspective in general is to ask your doctor, have I had comprehensive biomarker testing? What does that tell us? What does it tell me about what treatments I should be on or what kind of disease do I have? If, what about a clinical trial? It's not necessarily just a treatment of last resort, as we discussed. Sometimes they may be best care in their first line. I think it's also a really good question to ask is, this is great, and, let's make a decision now, but what's next? And what should I expect? And what kind of conversations come next? And are there other treatments available for me? And if I go on this first treatment, is that changing what I potentially can go on later? So I think there are a number of questions, and a lot of our websites, yours, mine, Lynn, have questions that you should ask your doctor based on what type, where you are in your treatment journey. Print them out, take them with you, look at them. If you're not in a frame of mind to do it, bring somebody with you who can ask these questions and write down the answers. Record the conversation or do it via FaceTime with somebody who can take notes for you. So I think that there are a lot of things. And I think that some of it is, on us as patient advocates to advocate on behalf of people so that they don't have to, demand and get guideline adherent care. But some of it is the patient can ask those questions also. And don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion.
That was going to be my next question, Andrea. So it's almost like we're in meetings together all the time when we talk about these things. So I think, I was talking to a friend recently, someone in her family has cancer, and the family member was saying that she feels bad asking for a second opinion, right? She feels like it's going against your doctor. And what I said was every single cancer patient should ask for a second opinion. I don't care who you are and where you're being seen. And so I can tell from your head shakes that you feel that way too.
Absolutely. And if you're worried about, offending your doctor, or if your doctor gets offended, run, because you should be with a different doctor who doesn't get offended by it.
Absolutely.
If you can. Not everybody can. Let's be realistic. Not everybody can, and not everybody has those options.
And that's a great point. And I also think I just want to put a plug in, and granted I'm biased because I'm a social worker, but if you have access to a social worker, a nurse navigator, a patient navigator, if you don't within your clinic system, call the cancer support community. We have navigators on our helpline. We have clinical trial specialists and nurses. We can help. Just like I know LUNGevity and PanCan, you have folks who can provide information so that people can make these informed decisions. So even if you live in a community where you don't readily have access, there are plenty of supports like our organizations that can help. So I want to take a step back. We talked a little bit about clinical trials, and Lynn, as the scientist on the call today, I want to ask if in very simple terms, you can explain what a clinical trial is. And I know that in light of COVID, we've heard lots about clinical trials. So if you're talking to someone who knows nothing about a clinical trial, especially when we're talking about cancer, what do you tell them?
So I think clinical trials break down into answering 3 questions. And the first, and because you're looking for a new drug, usually that's the clinical trials we're talking about is new drugs for treatments for a disease that you need to be treated for cancer. And the first question is it safe? So are you going to give me something, whether it's through a pill or through an infusion or something? Are you going to give me something that isn't going to kill me immediately or isn't going to make me go blind things that are really important, right? I mean, you really need to know, is it safe? Now, that doesn't mean there aren't side effects. And that will be evaluated with some of these drugs, but that basically you need to know, is it safe? The second thing you need to know is it going to work? Is it effective? Is it going to do what it's supposed to do, which is kill this cancer? And then the third one is, if you're going to make it widely available, is it better than what my other options? Is it better than what we have otherwise? And those really make up the 3 questions that you ask in the 3 phases of clinical trials. A phase 1 clinical trial asks if it's safe, a phase 2 clinical trial asks if it's effective, and a phase 3 clinical trial asks if it's better than what we have otherwise. And that's how we make advances. How are we going to know what's best for people unless we ask those questions and we try things that are new? And that, I think, sums up what I think a clinical trial is. And people who, thank you to all those people who go on clinical trials and help us learn how we can not only treat them, but how we can treat the next person who faces their disease.
Absolutely. It's important for healthcare and a cancer patient's health, but I think sort of the civic engagement and making sure that, all of these people are doing this and they're contributing to the health and well-being of future people and generations. It's such an important point. And Lynn, one thing you said, I want to put an extra fine point on. One of the questions we get a lot from patients is, will I be a guinea pig, right? And also, will I not receive any treatment? And I think when you talked about phase 3, treatment as usual, we are comparing sort of the standard of care to this new treatment. It is very rare for a cancer patient to receive a placebo because there are so many options these days. And so we often get that question from patients. And I just wanted to make sure that we hit on that phase 3, which is really the final trial before the medication goes to the public and is approved by the FDA. It usually almost always is against standard of care. Is that right?
That's right. That even though those are randomized trials, and when you go into, usually phase 3 trials are randomized, you go in, you may get standard of care, you may get standard of care plus the new treatment, but it will never be anything. It will always be the best that we have. Right now, the standard of care is the best that we have right now. We're seeing if the new thing can be better, but you'll never get less than the best that we have in a clinical trial.
Thank you. I think that helps to allay one of the biggest fears from cancer patients. And, we talk about clinical trials quite a bit, but, and Andrea, this question is for you too. How does a patient find the right clinical trial, especially if we're talking about they've had their tumor tested and they need to find something specific? What do they do?
Well, I know PanCan has a great matching service, and they run their own trials as well. But in general, there's clinicaltrials.gov, which is comprehensive, but really not patient-centric. It's tough to use. And this is assuming, Elizabeth, that somebody wants to find something on their own, right? I mean, first step, obviously, is talk to your healthcare provider or your team about it. But if you also want to go do research on your own, That's sort of the big, NIH type of database of clinical trials. There are also organizations have clinical trial finder app. We have an actual tool that you can use that helps to digest and put in patient-centric terms. There are matching services as well, Emerging Med and others. Some organizations you mentioned, help to navigate you to a clinical trial as well. So I think there are a variety of steps that a person can take to both educate themselves as well as to talk to their providers about it. There are also a lot of patient groups where it's peer-to-peer information sharing as well. Not always necessarily, the best thing out there, but it is a source of information for you to then go and see if it may be right for you in talking with your doctor.
Yep. We hear all the time that patients, even if you're on sort of an online peer-to-peer network or in a support group, you're going to listen to one another, whether it's about what clinical trials are available, whether it's about side effects. I know, Lynn, you mentioned that, hearing the experience, but I'll say that it's still important for patients to go to their doctor and say, hey, I have a friend who has pancreatic cancer. They said X, Y, and Z, but I want to confirm that. Can you help me understand that and make sure that the information that you're getting is right?
Yep.
So, and I want to clarify, biomarker testing is not just to help us find a clinical trial. It can also help patients find the treatment that standard of care treatment that they're going to use today. Can you talk about the difference? And if, when the patient's talking to their physician, how do they know? Should they be in a clinical trial or should they have that standard of care?
So at least at least in our case, the one of the nice things about that molecular testing, that genomic testing, is that very often that will come with a list of trials that match to those particular alterations. So some of the work is done for the physician or the patient by the diagnostic company that runs those particular tests. So that's a good place to start. And then there's really kind of three categories of drugs that if you have a molecular alteration, one is it can be already approved. And that means, everything's been tested, that that's exactly the right thing to give that person, and it's been tested in that disease, and that's terrific. It may still be in testing. So it may be, in that case, the only way to get it is a clinical trial, is to actually enroll in that clinical trial to get that drug. And then there's also a category called off-label use of a drug. So it's been, and this happens pretty often in pancreatic cancer, it's been approved in another cancer, for instance, in lung cancer, but it's not approved in pancreatic cancer, and it's not approved in a tissue agnostic and where it's based only on the biomarker either. But there are times when the physician can decide that's the right thing for this patient and can treat that patient with that particular drug. It's best to get that information, to do it. If you can do it in a clinical trial, we will learn more if you do it through a clinical trial. But it is possible to get those drugs in that off-label situation as well. So there really are kind of a range of alternates.
So it sounds like that conversation with the physician is of critical importance, whether you are going to have them help you find the right treatment in this moment with what's available, whether you are going to ask for help to navigate to a clinical trial, or like you said, Lynn, talking about this off-label discussion, which I think comes as a surprise to lots of patients who aren't aware that it's an option. So really starting with the physician, the care team, your nurse, having those conversations and saying, what's right for me? What are my options? And Andrea, back to your point, going and getting second opinions, because if you can, one person may not know all the options, right? So making sure that you're getting as much information as you possibly can.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, Elizabeth, and the resources are out there. So if you're looking for a specialist, I know, many of the organizations have either specialist maps, because there are people who specialize in certain types of lung cancer or pancreatic cancer in the country where you can go to get a second opinion or to ask the question. And then there are also, navigators and others who can help you get to that right resource.
Yep. Excellent point. So in a perfect world, all of us who are at risk of cancer, who get cancer, who have cancer progress, we get all of the information we need. We make excellent choices and we have access to the most innovative care, right? That's perfect. But we don't live in a perfect world. So we know that there are lots of barriers. And Andrea, I'll start with you in lung cancer. What are some of the barriers that patients experience when they go to get biomarker testing?
Wow. Where to even begin on that one? I think there are, at the patient level, at the provider level, and at the system level, there are kind of barriers along the entire trajectory, if you will. And so, at the person level, I think some of the barriers are lack of awareness, lack of education. The information now, we're translating a lot of materials into health literate forms, as well as into other languages as well. So it's not a lot of very complex medical jargon that's being thrown at somebody, but actually just the essentials of what it is that you need to know. I think that that's also helpful to many providers who are generalists. They're not specialists, so they have to keep track of a lot of cancers that are changing rapidly and information. So it's important to educate at the provider level. That's another barrier, awareness and just education. At the systems level, I think it's payment, access to the drugs, requirements for things like prior authorization, and other sort of very, payer-related barriers that exist. I think that they're at the systems level, again, they're everything from the complexities. This is, it happens to a patient, but it's not a patient problem necessarily. Everything from, is enough tissue being taken out of your body in order to do all the testing that's required? Tissue acquisition, right? Huge barrier, because if they don't take enough, you got to go back in for a second biopsy. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. Everything to, is the tissue being handled the proper way once it comes out of your body to when it gets to the lab so that they can run the tests on it? All of these, the science is changing so quickly that I think the rest of the systems are kind of struggling to keep up a little bit in some respects, and to catch up and just to make sure that it happens. So I think there are barriers along the way, but the important thing is I really think they're addressable, and I really think that it's starting to happen. And so this, while yet right now we're sort of at an inflection point, I think, 5 or 10 years down the road, hopefully we won't be having this conversation, quite honestly.
Yeah, and it speaks to the incredible importance of advocacy. And I know that LUNGevity and PanCan and cancer support community, we work together quite a bit on advocacy efforts. And it's incredibly important for individual patients to understand that your story matters, that when you talk about those barriers that you faced, that helps us to be able to go speak to members of Congress, to be able to speak to decision makers and say, this isn't good enough, right? We want patients to be able to navigate the system and get the best care. So, Lynn, do you find some of the same barriers with patients dealing with pancreatic cancer?
Yeah, we do. We have maybe a higher barrier with just the general idea of precision medicine. I think in pancreatic cancer, we don't have as many drugs that are approved specifically for pancreatic cancer in this field. It's a relatively rare cancer type. And so a general oncologist will see maybe 4 or 5 people a year with pancreatic cancer, and they don't necessarily think about, I should get molecular testing on these people. So we find that it's really important. We tell people to call PanCan, call our helpline, and learn about it. We have a program called Know Your Tumor program, which is where we facilitate people getting molecular testing if it's not being offered, and make sure that they're asking for it, but that we can help if it's not being offered to them. And so it's, there's lots of as Andrea said, there's barriers all along the way for this, and it takes different approaches to try to break down all those barriers. But one thing that is really important is for the patient to at least be aware of these possibilities.
Yep, absolutely. And one of the things that both of you have said many times is just how quickly the science is evolving here. So I want to ask you to get out your crystal ball. And in 5 to 10 years, let's, fingers crossed, hope we are out of a pandemic, right? We're not thinking about COVID anymore. So we're out of the pandemic. Biomarker testing has evolved and changed. And what is the patient experience like? How much has changed? What do you think this is going to look like in 5 to 10 years? And Andrea, I'll ask you first.
5 to 10 years, crystal ball, I would say, I'd love to say lung cancer is cured or cancer is cured, but as we know, this is the 50th anniversary for the war on cancer. So, it takes time. It takes time. But particularly from a biomarker and from the lung cancer patient experience, I would say that when anyone is diagnosed with lung cancer, particularly non-small cell lung cancer, because there are different types of lung cancer, but they go in and it is just done automatically, reflexively, where they have their biopsy, it is sent off to a lab, they automatically do a full panel of tests to understand what's driving the cancer, what's, what is made up of. And it comes back, and before a person has their first appointment with their oncologist, that they have all of that information at their fingertips so that they can have an informed conversation with their doctor and be put on the right treatment, or quite honestly, the way the disease is going right now, cocktail of treatments that can not only stop the progression of their current disease, but also then stop other resistance things from popping up as well. And I do think in 5 or 10 years, that's a realistic hope, if you will.
Yeah, so it'll be the expectation. You go to the doc, and that's what you should be able to expect.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah. Lynn, what about you? What do you think?
Oh, I love it. I think that's exactly right. I think where pancreatic cancer is slightly behind, but I think in 5 or 10 years we'll be there too. And it'll just be reflexive on that first diagnostic biopsy to get enough tissue to learn what you can about and to the treatment course for that particular patient. I think that's absolutely doable.
Yep, that's great. That gives me hope. It's a good thing. I hope those crystal balls are reading correctly today. So, we've talked about a ton of different information, and I just want to remind folks who are watching today on Facebook, who watch in the archive, that the cancer support community has a great helpline. We have lots of educational materials. You can contact us, look at our website, cancersupportcommunity.org, or our helpline at 888-793-9355. But I also know, as you've heard today, that LUNGevity and PanCan have extraordinary resources too. So I wanted to ask if Lynn, you mentioned the helpline. What else does PanCan have to offer patients who might have questions?
Yeah, so we do believe in the right track, which is something that a number of advocacy organizations have worked together to define in terms that we can then use across the field. But that means the right team. So yes, see a specialist. I think in particular in pancreatic cancer, since it's just still relatively rare. People who are very experienced with the disease often know some of the tricks that other individuals may not, and that's important to have the right team, to get the right tests, to get in pancreatic cancer, both genetic testing and biomarker testing of your tumor tissue. They both give important information. And then get the right treatment, and especially consider clinical trials all along the way. We also say share your data. We can learn from people's experience. So there's many ways to share your data, share your information and your experiences that could very well help the patients of the future. So those are kind of following the right track is something that, and we do have a helpline, and it gives individual support and information. So we're wherever you are along that journey, and whatever those questions are, why we have people that can help you, give you those answers.
And Lynn, if patients call your helpline and they want to be connected to a clinical trial, you mentioned the clinical trial matching service. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, we keep an up-to-date database of the pancreatic cancer clinical trials that are open in the US, and we call around on a monthly basis and say, are you still open? Are you taking patients? So that we know that when we're giving information, that it's as accurate as it can be as to whether that clinical trial is available or not. And then we do our best to match it to the stage of disease, what are the what they call the eligibility requirements for those particular trials. We try to get, we don't want to give patients information for things they aren't eligible for.
Sure.
We try to give them a list of things that we think that they could consider. And then we ask them to take that to their doctor, because really their doctor knows the next level of detail that can help them narrow down and determine which trials could be best for them, and then try to provide whatever support we can to actually help them get on that trial. But that is, the first place to start is to say what's out there.
Yeah.
What's out there that might be relevant for me, and then to give them, yes, a list of questions that they can ask their doctor and say, consider this, please consider this.
That's great. That's incredible sort of wraparound service to make sure that if there's a trial out there, the patient can find it and hopefully be able to access it, Lynn. So thank you to PanCan for that service. And Andrea, LUNGevity does extraordinary work too. Can you talk about some of the resources that you offer to lung cancer patients and their families?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. Like PanCan, we too are part of the right track in its inception and delivery as well, but also just the methodology and the process. But in terms of services, we too have a helpline. It's on the website. It's a very comprehensive website also, so strongly encourage anybody diagnosed with lung cancer to visit. There are education materials. There are downloadable questions to ask. There's connectivity to patient communities and resources. We also recently launched the patient gateways, with KRAS being the first one, which has a specialist map as well as curated information feeds on different types of lung cancer. So I think that it's a very rich resource for people. And then obviously the clinical trial matching and tools available as well. Similarly, we have patient meetups, which are moderated by an oncology nurse that we have on staff, just to answer your questions, as well as very rich virtual and social media opportunities also. So it kind of runs the gamut, but I think that most of the information is there, and certainly we're all available as well to answer questions and to help.
And we've all had to learn how to deliver these services virtually over the last year,
Yes,
which is one of the few silver linings, right? That we're able to provide more services to more people than ever before, because we all can do it sitting in front of our computer. And by all, I mean people who have access, and we're working to help make sure that as many people have access as possible.
Yeah. I think it's hugely important because, many of our diseases that we represent, they're very isolating diseases, and people don't always avail themselves of in-person things, but virtually they can. Or they're too sick to travel or other things. And I think it is one of the silver linings.
Absolutely. It's important to pull out some silver lining from the last couple of years. So I know we've served more patients than ever. And I know that the same goes for almost every cancer organization at this point. Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the time and we're coming close to the end of our hour together. It passed very quickly. I learned a ton from both of you, as I always do when you speak. But I just want to ask, is there any sort of last thoughts, ideas that you would leave with patients as they're thinking about biomarker testing? And Lynn, I'll start with you this time.
I think knowledge is power. I think that, the more that the patient doesn't have to be a molecular biologist, but they have to understand that there's information in both their genes, their inherited genes, as well as the tumor itself. The tumor can give us information, and that making sure that people who can interpret that information are are available to them, that they ask those questions, that they advocate for themselves. And in the case of pancreatic cancer, call PanCan, because we'll help you figure out what what questions you should ask.
Absolutely. Thank you. Andrea?
No, I think that's very well said. And I do think knowledge is power. And I think that it's really important for people to educate themselves. And if they don't want to find somebody else who can be educated on their behalf necessarily. And one of the resources that I was remiss in not mentioning is the noonemissed.org website that we have, which is solely focused around biomarker testing. But it has great resources like, how do you read your test report? What does this mean to me? And all of the in very straightforward language so that you can understand it. But absolutely, be sure to inform yourselves, have full knowledge before making treatment decisions, and at a minimum, ask the right questions.
Yep. Absolutely. Knowledge is absolutely power. And I think it's incredibly important to also understand that you don't have to do it by yourself, right?
No.
You've got organizations like LUNGevity, like PanCan, like Cancer Support Community, and virtually any cancer that you may be diagnosed with, there's an organization that can help you. And so we're here, our helplines are here. You don't need to navigate this alone because it is so complex. And so while knowledge is power, just also know that you can tap into these incredible advocates like Lynn and like Andrea and all of our colleagues across the spectrum who are offering these extraordinary resources. So with that, I just want to, again, Andrea, Lynn, thank you so much. You're extraordinary advocates. LUNGevity Foundation and PanCan are wonderful organizations available to pancreatic cancer patients, lung cancer patients and their families. The cancer support community is always available for anybody impacted by cancer, and all of us provide our services for free. So there should not be a barrier to accessing our services. We're here for you. And again, ladies, just thank you so much. Thank you to LabCorp Oncology today for making this possible. It's been my pleasure to have everyone join us for this conversation. And if you have any questions about making treatment decisions, biomarker testing, or anything else we've discussed today, or generally about cancer, please connect with our experienced and licensed navigators at our cancer support helpline. That number again is 888-793-9355. And our website is cancersupportcommunity.org. And Andrea and Lynn, do you want to put a plug for your websites before we sign off? I want to make sure that people know how to reach you. So Andrea, how do they find LUNGevity?
So LUNGevity is similar to yourselves, Elizabeth. It's www.lungevity.org.
Perfect. And Lynn?
And Pancreatic Cancer Action Network is too much of a mouthful, so it's PanCan, PANCAN.org.
Well, one day maybe we'll be CSC.org, but not yet. So, all right, ladies, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody that joined us today. Have a great afternoon.